Nyknce Hoekstra is our next speaker, and Nyknce works at the Bolk Institute in the Netherlands, and she's going to talk on scenarios to limit environmental nitrogen losses from dairy expansion. So Nyknce is no stranger to Ireland. She did her PhD in Johnstown Castle in County Wexford, and she returned to Ireland after that for a time as well. She's a big interest in grassland and soil and biodiversity, and she's worked on a range of products from grazing management to species-rich grassland to soil load-bearing capacity and peat meadows. So she's got a lot of experience in different sections. She completed her master's in crop science in Wageningen in 2002 and came to Agasten in 2002. And she was involved in a lot of research projects, including capital slurry, which would be very topical for people at the minute. Nyknce, so we'll let you away there though on scenarios to limit environmental nitrogen losses from dairy expansion. So yeah, that's right there now. Thanks a million, Nyknce.
All right, thanks, Siobhan, and thanks for inviting me to this meeting. So I spent a good few years in Ireland doing research in Johnstown Castle, starting in 2002. And the work I'm talking about now is about a model study that we started doing back in 2014. So some of the backgrounds to it have changed. This stage we finished it, this publication was done in 2020. And here you see some of my co-authors with whom I worked on this. And the topic is the scenarios to limit environmental nitrogen losses from dairy expansion, so a model study. Back when we started this in 2014 and through to 2020, we were talking about Foodwise 2025. And the aim was to increase milk production by 60% at the time. But also the aim was to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, nutrient loss to water, and ammonia emissions. And I suppose Dibna has already talked about how important it is to reduce these emissions also in terms of nitrates. At the time, a lot of research was done in Ireland, partly the student projects and abroad, and we were getting a lot of new information on nitrogen losses from urine and dung and slurry and fertilizer in applications, and also on the effect of inhibitors, so nitrification and urea inhibitors. But the problem is, these were all very fragmented bits of information. And when you try to extract that to farm level, it all becomes very complicated. So if your fertilizer type and application rate, which affects your grass growth and nitrogen content, but this fertilizer also results in emissions. And then, of course, how much grass you grow affects your stocking rate, and your stocking rate affects your slurry application and your urine and dung deposition, which in turns also have emissions and effect on grass growth and nitrogen content. And then you have to impose the effect of the inhibitors on these emissions. So the inhibitors might affect the amount of fertilizer that is actually taken up by the grass, but also the emissions of it, and then the emissions of urine and dung deposition as well. And at the same time, the slurry application technique may affect the amount of ammonia emissions from slurry. So this is very complicated, and it's not easy to really to say what the net effect of any measure is going to be, just from the individual effects on slurry or dung emissions. So one of the objectives when we started this project was to develop grassland management strategies that are both environmentally friendly but also economically sustainable. And we wanted to assess individual mitigation measures, such as using these inhibitors or, for example, low emission slurry spreading techniques on farm level, but also evaluate cost effectiveness. So to that end, we developed a model to simulate an Irish grass-based dairy farm and the effects of farm management on nitrogen losses, production, and economic performance. And this includes the option to use nitrification and urease inhibitors and low emission slurry application techniques. And we apply this model to assess the effect of different strategies or scenarios to achieve the increased production goals of Food Voice 2020. And we assessed its effect on nitrogen utilization, on N-loss pathways, and the economic performance of at farm level. And saying that, I realized listening to them now that we may be in a slightly different position right now, where we're talking about decreasing nitrogen fertilizer levels. At the same time, I think we can still learn a lot from the scenarios, the way we did them before. So these are the scenarios we worked with. So we had our baseline scenario, which was a typical Irish dairy farm. And we had 3 intensification scenarios, with which the aim was to increase milk production per hectare. So IG was increased grass production, and we increased this production through optimized fertilizer application rate and sward management. Then IC was increased concentrate feeding rate, and we increased the concentrate feeding rate by 100%. So that's relative to the typical Irish dairy farm. And then IP was the final scenario, and this was based on research farm at Moorpark Jaggers Research Station, and it was aimed at increasing farm profit through an increase in grass utilized per hectare and higher genetic merit. So if you look a little bit at what these scenarios look like, for our baseline scenario, we had a fertilizer nitrogen application of 160 kilos per hectare per year, phosphor and potassium of 5 and 13 kilos per hectare, concentrate per cow of just over 800 kilos per cow per year, and a milk yield in liters per cow per year of over 5,000. Now, as I said, increased grass production, that was all trying to grow more grass, so we increased the nitrogen fertilization, but also we increased the P and the K fertilization to get the soil P and K status to optimize that. And while the concentrate feeding level and the milk yield per cow remained the same. So this increased concentrate scenario, we kept the fertilization was kept all the same, but the only thing we changed there was the increased concentrate feeding rate per cow. And at this IP, so this final increased profit scenario, we increased both fertilizer, so to try and optimize our grass growth. At the same time, here you see we actually lowered concentrate feeding rate because more grass was fed. So an idea was to get as much feed from grass as possible. And at the same time, we slightly increased the genetic merit of the cow. So the milk production per cow was increased a little bit. And this all was done for moderately drained soil. Then on each of these scenarios, we imposed 2 mitigation options, if you like. So the first mitigation option was TS, so that's the trailing shoe. And the idea of that was that we were trying to reduce ammonia emissions by spring application of slurry with trailing shoe. And the second one is the inhibitor scenario, where we applied urease inhibitors to fertilizer and nitrification inhibitors to animal feed. And here I must say we didn't take into account actually if these things were allowed or not at the time. So this was just a kind of theoretical kind of what would be the highest effect of inhibitors you could get by applying them on the farm. So those were the 2 mitigation options we worked with in our scenarios. Then on to some first outputs from this model. So if you look at the baseline scenario, we had a herbage yield of around 10 tons, stocking rate of 1.8, and a milk production of 8.3 tons per hectare. Now, first, if you go to the increased grass production, we increased our grass production by a good bit, and that resulted in an increased stocking rate because we had more feed on offer. We could increase our stocking rate. And that also increased the milk production in tons per hectare. And the total increase was 38% increase compared to the baseline, so the typical Irish farm. So that is not close to the 60% in the food-wise 2025 target. Then if you look at the increased concentrate scenario, that herbage yield stayed the same. Stocking rate increased as well because we were feeding more concentrate, and the milk production in ton per hectare also increased by about 16%. And then the final scenario, so the increased profit scenario, the herbage yield increased a good bit. Also the stocking rate increased just lower than the scenario because of the lower concentrate feeding rates. And the total milk production increased by by just over 60%. So with that scenario, we could actually achieve the food-wise 2025 target. But it also showed us that achieving this 60% increase was going to be very hard using just intensification, so without increasing the total area for dairy production. Then looking at farm net profit, and these are based on the figures we were working back in 2018, so I'm not entirely sure whether these are still relevant today. But the relative to each other, I suppose they're still right. So for the IG, so the increased grass production and increased profit scenarios, we see a rise, so an increase in farm net profit in euros per hectare. But for the concentrate scenario, we actually see a decrease in profits. So it just shows that increasing the level of concentrate feeding is a very expensive way of increasing your production. And then also we calculated the costs of adding these mitigation options. First, let me say that these mitigation options didn't really have a large effect on herbage yield and milk production, but they mainly resulted in a small or in a reduction of the losses. And if you looked at the trading shoe scenario, the cost of that was more or less neutral. So the extra cost of applying the trading shoe machine was more or less offset by extra production, so extra nitrogen utilized for grass production. The inhibitors, the way we used them at the time, came at about 70 euros per hectare extra cost for this scenario. Then on to some nitrogen results. I'll try to talk you through this slowly. What you see here is the nitrogen input, output, and loss of these four scenarios. B is the baseline, IG is the increased grass, IC increased concentrate, and IP increased profit. And the total bar is the total nitrogen input of all these scenarios. So you see that the total nitrogen input ranged from 211 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for the baseline scenario, that's a typical Irish farm, to 318 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for the increased grass scenario. And the other two scenarios were just below that. Now, if you look at the nitrogen output in terms of milk and meat, we saw an increase. So it increased from the baseline scenario up to the concentrate, grass, and the profit scenario. And there the profit scenario showed the highest output in terms of milk and meat. So increasing these inputs also resulted in an increase in nitrogen output. At the same time, let me go back there, you also see that the losses, so the top part of the bars, is increasing as well. So this increase came at a cost, but I'll get into more detail about that later on. Now, if you look at the mitigation options, where we have the trading shoe, and then these are the inhibitors, and then these are two scenarios combined. You see that there's relatively little effect on the nitrogen input. So with using these inhibitors, you're not adding extra nitrogen onto the farm. There was a little increase in nitrogen output, and it was mainly the trading shoe. So this nitrogen efficiency is increasing a little bit, and the inhibitors as well. And I suppose that effect could have been stronger, but we were careful in contributing to positive effects on grass growth of these inhibitors, because the results at the time didn't show that strong an effect. So these effects weren't that big. What we did see is that there was an increase in the nitrogen that remained in the soil and that may have become available later on. If you look at the nitrogen loss here at the top, there's these are shown both including and excluding N2. And N2 loss, I'm not talking about that in the remainder of the presentation because that's an environmentally benign gas, and it doesn't have any negative effects on the environment. So I won't go into that for the rest of the presentation. Now, if you look at the nitrogen loss in kilos nitrogen per hectare, for all scenarios, we see that this intensification, so this increased production, came at a cost and resulted in an increased nitrogen loss compared to the baseline. And it ranged from an increase of 19 kilos of nitrogen per hectare for the increased concentrate scenario to 55 kilos per hectare for the increased profit scenario. And with the increased concentrate scenario, I have to say that it looks as if that's not so large, so that the environmental impacts are less than for the other two scenarios. So the first thing I have to say there is, of course, the increase in yield was lower as well. And also you increase your inputs in terms of concentrate feeding. And that's going to have an external effect, like that concentrate feed is grown somewhere else, and we're not taking into account the environmental impacts of what happens off farm. So that's not taken into account in this scenario analysis. Then if you look at the impact of the mitigation options, see, first of all, the trailing shoe has a small positive effect, but all the scenarios are still above this baseline level. So it still means that the total nitrogen loss is higher than the baseline. The inhibitors have a stronger effect, and here you see, but still these emissions are higher. And if you combine both scenarios, then see for the increased concentrate scenario that the total nitrogen loss is below that of the baseline scenario. So that means that with this scenario, you can increase your production without increasing your nitrogen loss in terms of kilos of nitrogen per hectare. But as all the other scenarios show, that these mitigation scenarios were not enough to offset the increases that in nitrogen losses that were brought about by the intensification. Now, if you look in a little bit more detail, so in the different, because all these different mitigation options have very different effects on the different types of nitrogen losses. So first of all, if you look at the ammonia losses, the ammonia losses are the biggest source of the nitrogen losses. And in all scenarios, you see that there's an increase in nitrogen loss compared to the baseline scenario, ammonia loss. And the main sources of this loss are through slurry spreading, housing, and also an indirect impact of grazing as a result of the higher stocking rates in some of these scenarios. And there was also an increased loss through fertilizer application in the IG and IP scenario. Now, if you look at the mitigation, the effect of mitigation, and here you see that, first of all, the trailing shoe has a scenario, the mitigation option has a strong reduction in the ammonia losses, so a reduction of -11% compared to without applying this mitigation option. But as you see, levels are still above the baseline levels, so still indicating an increase in ammonia losses. And the inhibitors have only a limited extra effect. This is the effect of the inhibitors on top of the trailing shoe scenario. And you see there's only a very small effect of the inhibitors on ammonia losses. Then if you move on to the nitrate losses, again, you can see that the nitrate increases for all the scenarios, and that ranges from up to 50% for the increased grass and profit scenario, and 14% for the increased concentrate scenario. And this is mainly related to the nitrogen application and grazing, so the losses from grazing You can see here the gray bars, they're the largest losses, so that would be mainly from urine deposition. There's also the nitrogen application would be the other, so the fertilizer application would be the other main source of nitrate losses. And if you look at the mitigation effect here, you see that trailing shoe has very little effect on nitrate leaching, which is logical. It's not designed to do that. It's designed to decrease the ammonia emissions. And here we see a very strong effect of these inhibitors. And you see a total reduction of -37%. And here you see that in terms of nitrates, these inhibitors actually reduce the environmental loss of nitrate to below the baseline level. So with these nitrates, you could have an increase in production. And if you use these inhibitors properly and optimally, then you could still limit your nitrate losses to what they were for the baseline, and even decrease them. But like I said, that's not a lot. So, but they are very effective in negating these increases in nitrate losses. Here you see that that's what. And then finally, the N2O losses, and N2O losses are important greenhouse gas. Here you see that the losses here are much lower than the losses of ammonia and nitrate, and the increases because of these scenarios are lower, and that's because there's a lot of baseline emissions. So even if you don't have any agricultural activity, there's still a lot of emissions occurring from grasslands. So the extra bit you're doing there isn't having as much of an impact. Here again, we see a very strong effect of these inhibitors, and they're all reduce the nitrate loss or the N2O losses to below the baseline level. So they're very effective in reducing the N2O losses. So far, I've been talking about the nitrogen losses in terms of nitrogen in kilos per hectare. Now, there's always a lot of discussion about whether you should express these losses in nitrogen kilos per hectare or per ton of milk, so the milk footprint. So I plotted those as well for all scenarios. So here, the scenarios without the mitigation, and the baseline here is the black line on top. And here you see that if you look at the intensification scenarios compared to the baseline, they're, with exception from the IG scenario, the other ones are at the same level or below the baseline scenario. So that means that in terms of nitrogen loss per kilo or per ton milk produced, these systems are doing equally well compared to the baseline. So you have a higher production, but you have the same N footprint or milk footprint. Then if you start applying these trailing shoe and inhibitors, and here the combined scenario, there you see that for all scenarios, the milk footprint is lower for the increased, for the more intense scenarios than for the baseline scenarios. So in terms of, the nitrogen losses per hectare, they are higher, even when all mitigation options are applied. And lower nitrogen footprint is possible if you apply these inhibitors. And the thing is always kind of, which one do you look at? Like from this, it would be, from a farm point of view, it would be very tempting to say, okay, well, sure, we'll look at the milk production or the milk footprint, because that's like, if they're going to produce this milk somewhere else, it's going to be worse for the environment. So we'd better do it here in Ireland. And the thing there is that it's important to make a distinction between local and global impact. So with the nitrates emissions, you can't offset nitrate losses to the water bodies around the farm with improved production compared to somewhere else. So that's something that you really should look at in terms of nitrogen losses per hectare. Whereas something like N2O emissions, you could really look at that in terms of a milk footprint, because that really matters. If this milk can be produced more efficiently in Ireland than someone else, it makes sense to do it in Ireland. So that's important to kind of distinguish between those different pathways. So to wrap up, with our modeling study, we've shown that it's possible to increase milk output by 60% through intensification. But it's really at the upper limit of what is possible with the kind of the management options we had at the time. And other than that, you would have to increase the area using the standard or typical farm management to increase milk output further. Some of these intensification scenarios had a positive effect on farm net profits. So that was the increased grass and increased profit scenario, whereas the concentrate scenario actually reduced farm net profit. The use of the inhibitors resulted in a substantial decrease in nitrogen losses, but it wasn't enough to entirely eliminate absolute increases. So in terms of this increased milk production, with the mitigation scenarios, it resulted in a lower nitrogen footprint, but higher nitrogen losses per hectare, even when mitigation options were used. So this indicates that further improvements in farm nitrogen efficiency are necessary. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Nyknce. That was a really good presentation. Yeah, loads out of it there. I think Liam's getting ready another poll, but just you talked about the trail and shoe there, and you said that it'd be paid for by the extra nitrogen utilised. Do you know what kind of time period that'd be over?
Sure, we're mainly, so I'm not sure if you're really talking about investment costs and all that. That's like, we didn't look into that, but this was based on the running costs. So the increased costs of getting the contractor in, you know what I mean, and the benefits you would get from the extra nitrogen that you utilize for your grass growth. And that was about even in the scenarios we ran.
Okay. Someone has a question in there. Can you comment on the impact of the inhibitors on the soil biology? And I suppose maybe can you tell us a little bit about how those inhibitors work?
Well, I must admit, I'm not an expert on that at all. I was really relying on my colleagues in Johnstown Castle for input on all that and all the research they did. So I did put it in a model, but I'm afraid I can't really go into depth on that. But I suppose there's a lot of discussion about whether you should use these inhibitors and what the effect, also the long-term effect on soil biology, but also if you end up in the human food chain, what's going to happen with that. So that's definitely a discussion that has to be had. Yeah.
On the protected urea inhibitors, I suppose Fiona Brennan is doing work down in Johnstown Castle, and I think it was Fiona and Patrick Forstall had a study last year, and I think, you know, they found that it wasn't impacting negatively on soil biology. The inhibitors in the animal feed, how do they work?
So kind of in this case, we added the nitrification inhibitors to the animal feed. That was still, I don't think at this moment you would suggest that as a measure, but at the time it seemed a very efficient way. If you feed it to the animals, it will have impact on all the nitrogen excretion from the animals. So it will be effective in slurry application, will be effective in urine and dung deposition. And you don't need to time your nitrification or the inhibitor applications to the field, because it will be already in there at the moment it's deposited in the field. So it seemed a very efficient way of doing it. With hindsight, it may not have been the most realistic scenario.
Yeah. And Nyknce, you know Irish dairy farmers fairly well. You know, you worked here for a long time. And a lot of dairy farmers are focused on, you know, growing grass and reducing their concentrates. So from what you were saying there, do you think it'd be difficult to change Irish farmers' minds on this, or to get them to change their system and feed more concentrate?
I don't think. I think kind of one of the major strengths of the whole Irish dairy sector is their focus on grass. And already in these scenarios, I suppose, have shown that upping concentrate is a very expensive way of increasing productivity. And I suppose,
Yeah.
Like in the Netherlands, we have this totally different situation where we're very focused on concentrate feeding, and we're looking at Ireland to improve the grass utilization on our farms. So I suppose that's not a pathway I would advocate.
Very good. And just I suppose one more there before we go back to the panel discussion. How does the situation in the Netherlands compare to our situation in Ireland compared to the Netherlands?
Well, as we're saying here in Ireland, I hear you say talking about a 10% decrease in chemical fertilizer application rates. In the Netherlands, we've had politicians suggested that we should reduce the whole dairy herd with 50%. So those are totally different scenarios. And I must say, we are like the whole production system in the Netherlands is completely different. It's much more intensive than it is in Ireland. But at the same time, a 50% reduction will have a massive impact. But that is the discussion that's going on in the Netherlands at the moment. Yeah,
there's plenty of talk about the national herd here as well. But I think our minister came out this week and gave some reassurance on saying he wouldn't tell anyone to cut. But well, thanks very much, Nyknce.